A regular morning turns dark. It was a bright morning in the heart of the city, where the hustle and bustle seemed to have a rhythm of its own. The sun, in its golden splendor, peeked through the skyscrapers, casting elongated shadows on the pavement. People moved about, each lost in their world, some heading to work, others grabbing a coffee, and a few simply walking their dogs. The energy of the morning was unmistakable, a mix of urgency and calm that characterized urban life. Among the crowd, one man stood out, not because he sought attention, but because of his quiet presence. Jamal West, a tall, well-built black man in his mid-30s, walked down the street with measured confidence. His tailored navy blue suit clung to his athletic frame, and his freshly polished shoes clicked on the pavement with every step. His face was serene, his expression one of quiet contemplation, as if he had mastered the art of keeping his emotions in check. Jamal had just finished breakfast at a local diner, a quaint spot he had frequented for years. The waitstaff knew him by name, greeting him warmly whenever he walked through the door. His usual order, scrambled eggs, turkey bacon, and a side of fresh fruit, was always prepared to perfection, a small but comforting routine he indulged in whenever he could. Today, the diner was buzzing with its usual morning crowd, and as he took his last sip of coffee, Jamal felt a sense of calm before what promised to be another hectic day. After settling the bill, he exited the diner and headed toward his sleek black sedan, parked a few feet away. The car was one of his few indulgences, a symbol of his hard-earned success. His phone buzzed in his pocket, interrupting his thoughts. A quick glance revealed a message from his mother, reminding him about their dinner plans later that evening. Smiling, he typed a quick reply, assuring her he hadn't forgotten. Family was everything to Jamal, and despite his busy schedule, he always made time for his loved ones. As Jamal slipped his phone back into his pocket and reached for his car keys, he noticed two police officers walking toward him. The men's eyes were fixed on him, their gazes intense and scrutinizing. Instinctively, Jamal straightened his posture, though he continued to unlock his car. His heart rate quickened, but his face remained neutral. The two officers, both white men in their late 30s, wore serious expressions. The taller of the two, with a square jaw and a crew cut, had a name badge that read Riley. His partner, a slightly shorter man with a stockier build, had Jenkins emblazoned on his uniform. Neither of them smiled. Their approach was slow but deliberate, their eyes never leaving Jamal as they closed the distance. Jamal's instincts flared. He'd been in this situation before, too many times, in fact, to count. Despite his polished appearance, his professional accomplishments, and his impeccable record, Jamal knew that none of it mattered in moments like this. All they saw was his skin, and that alone seemed enough to make him suspicious. "Excuse me, sir," Officer Riley called out, his voice cutting through the ambient noise of the street. Jamal turned slowly, his hands visible at his sides, his face calm. "Yes, officer," Jamal replied, his voice measured and respectful. He met Riley's gaze directly, though there was a faint tightening in his chest. "Can we see some identification?" Riley's tone was more command than request, and there was no pretense of politeness. His eyes flicked briefly to Jamal's car, then back to him. Jamal furrowed his brow slightly, surprised by the sudden demand. "May I ask what this is about?" His tone remained calm, though inside he braced himself for whatever was coming. "We've had reports of suspicious activity in the area," Jenkins said, stepping forward. His voice was low and gruff, and Jamal noticed how his hand rested on the butt of his gun. "You fit the description." Jamal's heart sank, though he outwardly remained composed. This was the narrative he had come to know all too well. A black man in an affluent part of town, dressed well, driving a nice car. He was always suspect. His father had warned him about moments like these, had drilled into him the need to stay calm, to not give them any excuse to escalate. Yet, the frustration and indignity of it all gnawed at him. "I just had breakfast at the diner," Jamal explained, gesturing toward the direction he'd come from. "I'm heading to work. Is there a specific reason you need my ID?" Riley narrowed his eyes, clearly unamused. "Just show us your ID, and let's make this easy." Jamal sighed internally. There was no point in resisting, not when things could spiral out of control so easily. He reached into his jacket pocket slowly, keeping his movements deliberate, and pulled out his wallet. He handed his driver's license to Riley, who snatched it without a word. As Riley inspected the ID, Jenkins took a step closer, his posture tense, as though waiting for something to go wrong. Jamal could feel the weight of their scrutiny, the unspoken accusation hanging in the air. "What are you doing in this neighborhood?" Riley asked again, his tone more accusatory this time. Jamal's jaw tightened. "I just told you. I had breakfast at the diner. I'm on my way to work." He forced himself to keep his voice even, though anger simmered just beneath the surface. Riley's smirk returned as he handed the ID back. "A lawyer, There was something mocking in his voice. "That's a nice job." Jamal clenched his fist at his side, but maintained his composure. "Yes, a lawyer." "Well, we've had reports of some illegal activity around here," Jenkins chimed in. "You sure you don't have anything illegal in that car of yours?" Jamal felt the tension spike, his pulse quickening. He'd done nothing wrong, but that didn't matter now. This encounter was about to go down a dangerous path, and he had to decide, comply or resist. The decision wasn't easy. His mind raced with the possibilities, but one thing was clear. This wasn't about justice. It was about something much deeper, much more sinister. The legacy of strength. As Jamal stood next to his car, weighing his options, he could feel the eyes of Officer Riley and Officer Jenkins boring into him. The tension was almost palpable now, a thick cloud hanging between them. He could sense the hostility, the doubt in their eyes, as if they were waiting for him to make the wrong move. But this was not unfamiliar territory for Jamal. His mind wandered back to the lessons his father had taught him when he was a boy. Jamal West had come from a lineage of strong, determined men. His father, Charles West, was a civil rights attorney who had fought in some of the fiercest battles for racial justice in the state. His grandfather, Ezekiel West, had been one of the first black men in their town to open his own business, a small grocery store that became a symbol of resilience during the turbulent years of segregation. And Jamal's great-grandfather, a man he never met, but whose stories had been passed down through the generations, had been born a slave and fought for his freedom during the Civil War. The West family legacy was one of perseverance, strength, and above all, dignity. Jamal had always carried that with him, like an invisible shield. His father had instilled in him the importance of knowing who he was and where he came from, no matter how others might try to reduce him to a stereotype. Jamal had learned from an early age that the world often judged him based on the color of his skin before it even considered his character or accomplishments. "You have to be twice as good," his father would say during their long talks at the dinner table. "Not just to succeed, but to survive. Never give them a reason to doubt you. But if they do, never forget your worth." Those words echoed in Jamal's mind now as he stood under the gaze of the two officers. His father had prepared him for moments like this, but knowing it could happen didn't make it any easier when it did. It was exhausting. This constant vigilance, this need to prove himself over and over again to people who didn't want to see beyond his skin. He could still remember the day his father had taken him for a drive when he was 16, the day he got his first car. Charles had been proud. Jamal had worked hard, saving up for months to buy a used Honda Civic. But their celebratory drive had quickly turned sour when they were pulled over by a police officer for a routine traffic stop. The officer's eyes had scanned the car, and the two black men inside, suspicion plain on his face, before asking for their identification. Jamal had been confused then, not yet hardened by years of similar encounters. "But we didn't do anything wrong," he had whispered to his father, panic rising in his chest. His father's hand had tightened on the steering wheel, his jaw set in a way that Jamal had only seen when he was particularly upset. "It doesn't matter," Charles had said quietly. "Stay calm, keep your hands visible, and do exactly what he says. We'll talk later." Later that night, after they had returned home safely, Charles had sat Jamal down and explained the reality of being a black man in America. "It doesn't matter how polite you are, how educated you are, or how successful you become," his father had said with a heavy heart. "To some people, you will always be a threat. That's why you need to be smart. You need to know how to navigate situations like this. It's not fair, but it's the world we live in." Now, years later, Jamal stood facing a similar situation, except this time, he was alone. The weight of his father's words, of his family's history, pressed down on him. He knew he had done nothing wrong, but that didn't mean things couldn't go terribly wrong in the next few moments. "Step away from the car," Officer Riley repeated, his hand hovering near his holster. The unspoken threat was clear. Jamal took a slow breath, pushing back the surge of frustration that threatened to bubble up inside him. This was the tricky part, remaining calm while every fiber of his being screamed that he was being wronged. He couldn't afford to lose control. Not here, not now. "All right," Jamal said evenly, stepping back from the car with his hands raised slightly in a gesture of compliance. "But I need to make it clear, I haven't done anything wrong. I'm a lawyer, and I know my rights." The words hung in the air, a declaration of his awareness of the law, but also a subtle warning. Jamal knew that asserting his rights could either de-escalate the situation or provoke the officers further. It was a delicate balance. "A lawyer, huh?" Jenkins sneered, his eyes narrowing. "That's a nice story. But if you're so law-abiding, you shouldn't have a problem with us searching your car." Jamal's stomach churned. He knew he could refuse the search. They had no probable cause, no legitimate reason to detain him. But he also knew how quickly things could escalate if he asserted that right. This wasn't just about legality anymore. It was about survival. He had seen too many videos, heard too many stories of similar encounters ending in violence. "I don't consent to a search," Jamal said, his voice firm but controlled. "Unless you have a warrant or probable cause, I'm not obligated to let you search my car." Riley's eyes flicked to Jenkins, and Jamal saw the briefest flash of something. Frustration, maybe even anger, passed between them. Jenkins stepped closer, his hand now resting fully on his gun. "You sure you want to play this game?" Jenkins growled, his face inches from Jamal's. "We can make this real hard for you if you want." Jamal's heart pounded in his chest, but he kept his voice steady. "I'm not playing any games, officer. I know my rights, and I know I haven't done anything wrong." For a moment, there was silence, the air thick with tension. Jamal could feel the stares of passers-by, though no one dared intervene. They were in an upscale part of town, and the few people who noticed the scene unfolding seemed to quicken their pace, unwilling to get involved. Just when Jamal thought things might spiral out of control, a voice interrupted the standoff. "What's going on here?" Jamal turned to see a man in a sharp police uniform approaching. The newcomer had an air of authority about him, and both Riley and Jenkins immediately stiffened at his approach. The name on his badge read Captain Mills. Captain Mills was a tall man with graying hair at his temples, his eyes sharp and calculating. He glanced at Jamal, then at the two officers. "Is there a problem, officers?" Riley was the first to speak. "This man fits the description of a suspect in a string of break-ins, Captain. We were just about to search his vehicle." Mills raised an eyebrow, his gaze shifting to Jamal. "Is that so?" Jamal took a deep breath. This was his chance. "Captain, my name is Jamal West. I'm a lawyer, and I was just heading to work. These officers have no probable cause to detain me or search my vehicle. I haven't done anything wrong." Mills studied Jamal for a moment, then turned back to Riley and Jenkins. "Do you have any actual evidence linking Mr. West to these alleged break-ins?" Riley hesitated. "No, sir, but he matches the description." Captain Mills sighed, clearly displeased. Matching a vague description isn't enough to justify detaining someone without cause. "Let him go." Jenkins opened his mouth to protest, but Mills silenced him with a look. "That's an order." The two officers stepped back reluctantly, the hostility still lingering in their eyes. Jamal remained still, his pulse still racing, but he allowed himself a small breath of relief. For now, the situation was diffused, but he knew it wasn't over. Not by a long shot. Captain Mills nodded at Jamal. "You're free to go, Mr. West. Sorry for the inconvenience." Jamal nodded, his voice tight. "Thank you, Captain." As he turned to get into his car, he couldn't shake the feeling that this was only the beginning. The police officers had seen him as a threat, as less than human, and it was clear that their disdain ran deep. This encounter, though resolved without violence, left a bitter taste in Jamal's mouth. It was a stark reminder that no matter how far he had come, there were still those who saw him as nothing more than his skin color. Jamal's father had taught him to stay strong, to keep fighting for justice. And now, more than ever, he knew that his fight wasn't over. The burden of silence. Jamal sat in the driver's seat of his car, hands gripping the steering wheel tightly, his knuckles turning white from the pressure. His pulse pounded in his ears, a relentless reminder of the tension that still clung to him like a second skin. The encounter with Officers Riley and Jenkins had left him shaken, but he forced himself to take slow, deep breaths, trying to steady the storm raging inside. He glanced in his rearview mirror, watching the two officers walk away, their stiff postures still brimming with barely concealed hostility. Captain Mills had diffused the situation, but Jamal knew that his release wasn't a sign of true justice. It was simply a pause, a temporary reprieve in a lifetime of similar encounters where he had to tread carefully just to exist in peace. Jamal's phone buzzed in his pocket again, and he pulled it out, glancing at the screen. Another message from his mother. "Don't forget, dinner at 7. Love you." For a brief moment, a smile tugged at the corners of his mouth. His mother's texts were always warm, a constant reminder of the family he could lean on. But that warmth quickly faded, replaced by the heavy weight of what had just transpired. He couldn't tell her. Not again. His mother worried enough as it was. He didn't want to burden her with another story of how her son, despite all his achievements, could still be treated like a suspect, like a criminal, simply for existing. Jamal tossed his phone into the passenger seat and ran a hand over his face. He was a lawyer, successful by any standard. Yet, in moments like this, none of it mattered. The law he had sworn to uphold had felt like a fragile shield against the deep-seated biases that still ruled the streets. In courtrooms, he commanded respect with his sharp mind and eloquence, but out here, on these same streets, he was just another black man to people like Riley and Jenkins. The irony was not lost on him. He had dedicated his life to defending the law, believing in its potential for fairness and justice. But that belief had been tested time and again, and it wore on him, day after day, case after case, encounter after encounter. And yet, the burden wasn't just the racism he experienced firsthand. It was the silence. The suffocating silence that followed every time one of these moments passed without confrontation, without justice being truly served. Jamal had learned to keep quiet about these encounters. His family knew, of course, especially his father, who had walked this same path years before him. But the more successful Jamal became, the more he found himself suppressing these stories, hiding them from his friends, his colleagues, and even his clients. What good would it do to tell them? They couldn't understand. Not really. And worse, it could weaken the image he had worked so hard to build, the image of a man who had made it, who had risen above it all. But the truth was, he hadn't risen above anything. No matter how high he climbed, the ground beneath him was still treacherous, still uneven, still dangerous. Jamal's thoughts wandered back to his father, Charles West, a man who had fought battles in and out of the courtroom. Charles had been a civil rights attorney in the 1970s and 80s, fighting cases of police brutality, housing discrimination, and voter suppression. Jamal remembered the late nights when his father would come home, tired but determined, his shoulders heavy with the weight of the people he represented. As a child, Jamal had idolized his father, seeing him as a hero in a suit, fighting for the downtrodden, for those who had been denied justice. But as he grew older, he began to understand the toll that fight had taken on Charles. The long hours, the constant battles with systemic racism, the endless stream of clients whose lives had been torn apart by a system that refused to see their humanity, it had worn his father down. And though Charles rarely spoke about the strain, Jamal had seen it in his eyes. One evening, years ago, when Jamal had just started law school, he had asked his father a question that had been gnawing at him. "Dad, how do you keep going? After all these years, after everything you've seen, how do you still believe in the law?" Charles had paused, his gaze distant as he considered his son's question. "It's not about believing in the law, son. It's about believing in what the law can be. The law, as it is flawed, deeply flawed. But we fight because we believe it can be better. And if we don't fight, if we give up, then the people who want to keep it the way it is, or make it worse, they win." Jamal had nodded, taking his father's words to heart. But now, sitting in his car after yet another unjust encounter with the police, he wondered if his father had ever felt the same weariness that now settled into his bones. The fight wasn't just exhausting, it was never-ending. Jamal glanced at his watch. He had a meeting in less than an hour, and he couldn't afford to be late. His clients, a nonprofit organization fighting for housing equality, were counting on him. He needed to be sharp, focused, ready to battle in the courtroom. But how could he focus after what had just happened? How could he walk into that room with the same level of confidence and poise when, not 30 minutes ago, he had been treated like a common criminal? He took another deep breath, willing himself to push it aside. This wasn't the first time he had faced this kind of treatment, and he knew it wouldn't be the last. He had to compartmentalize, hack this moment away in the recesses of his mind, and get on with his day. That was the only way he had learned to survive. Jamal started the car, the engine purring to life beneath him. The city hummed around him as he merged into the steady flow of traffic. His mind drifted back to his father once more, to the quiet strength Charles had always shown. Jamal wondered how many similar encounters his father had endured over the years, how many times he had swallowed his pride and let the injustice pass just to keep moving forward. His thoughts were interrupted by another buzz of his phone. It was his assistant, Marcus, sending a quick update about the upcoming meeting. Marcus had been with Jamal for the past 3 years, and the young man's enthusiasm and dedication were invaluable. Jamal appreciated his assistant's work ethic, but more than that, he admired Marcus's unshakable belief in justice. The two of them had shared many late-night conversations in the office, discussing the state of the world and how they could make even the smallest difference through their legal work. Jamal knew that Marcus, like him, had his own struggles. As a black man in his 20s, Marcus was just starting to navigate the world that Jamal had been navigating for years. They often talked about the challenges of being black in their profession, about how they were perceived by their colleagues, by their clients, and by society at large. Marcus was idealistic, full of fire and passion. He believed in the power of the law, in the potential for justice. Jamal had once shared that same optimism, but now, as the years of fighting and witnessing injustice had worn on him, he wondered how long Marcus's idealism would last before the weight of reality started to chip away at it. Pulling into the parking garage of his office building, Jamal parked his car and sat there for a moment, staring at the dashboard. He had a choice to make. He could bury this moment, lock it away as he had done so many times before, and carry on with his day as if nothing had happened. Or he could let this be the moment where he no longer stayed silent. Jamal thought of his father, of the battles Charles had fought, and the ones Jamal had taken up in his stead. He thought of Marcus, full of hope and determination. And he thought of himself, of the years he had spent suppressing his own pain in the name of survival. Maybe it was time to stop surviving and start living. Living out loud, refusing to let these encounters be reduced to just another chapter in a book of silences. Jamal took another deep breath and stepped out of the car, straightening his suit jacket. As he walked toward the elevator, he felt a renewed sense of purpose. He had a meeting to attend, clients to represent, and a world to change. The unseen battle. The clink of Jamal's shoes echoed through the sleek, modern lobby of his office building as he made his way to the elevator. His reflection caught his eye in the gleaming marble floors, an image of calm professionalism, a man in control. But just beneath the surface, his thoughts churned, an unseen battle raging within. The incident with Officers Riley and Jenkins had left an indelible mark on his morning, and though he had forced himself to push it aside, he knew it wasn't truly gone. It was sitting in his chest, a heavy weight that pressed against his ribs. It was the kind of thing that lingered, affecting everything from his mood to his decision-making, even if he tried to ignore it. These moments were insidious, eroding the careful armor he had built over years of navigating the world as a black man. As the elevator doors slid open, Jamal stepped inside and pressed the button for the 18th floor. He took a deep breath, willing himself to focus on the task ahead. He was meeting with the leadership of the nonprofit housing organization he represented. They had been embroiled in a legal battle for nearly a year, fighting against discriminatory practices in housing developments that were pushing low-income black and brown families out of gentrifying neighborhoods. Jamal had been their advocate from day one, and now they were closing in on a crucial court date. But despite the importance of this meeting, Jamal's mind kept drifting back to the incident that morning. He thought about the thin line he had walked with those officers, a line so easily crossed. What would have happened if Captain Mills hadn't shown up? What if Jenkins had pushed harder, his hand hovering near his gun? The what-ifs swirled in his mind, each scenario darker than the last. The doors opened with a soft ding, and Jamal stepped out, squaring his shoulders. The office was bustling with activity, paralegals rushing between cubicles, phones ringing, and the hum of conversation filling the air. Marcus, his assistant, was waiting by the door of the conference room, a clipboard in hand. "Morning, Jamal," Marcus said with a bright smile, though his eyes were sharp, always observing. "You ready for this?" Jamal nodded, returning the smile, though it felt heavier than usual. "As ready as I'll ever be. How's everything looking?" Marcus handed him a brief summary of the latest updates on the case, his voice quick and efficient. "We've got everything lined up for today's strategy session. There's some new evidence I pulled from the city's housing commission records. Turns out, there's more going on with the zoning laws than we thought. I've got the files queued up for you." "Good work," Jamal said, glancing over the documents. "Let's hit them hard today." But even as he reviewed the paperwork, his mind kept slipping back to the officers, to the way their eyes had narrowed, the way their hands had rested too close to their weapons. He could still hear the patronizing tone in Jenkins' voice, the smirk on Riley's face. It was always there, just beneath the surface, the subtle but unmistakable signal that they didn't see him as a man. They saw him as a threat. "Jamal." Marcus's voice pulled him back to the present. Jamal looked up, realizing he hadn't heard a word of what his assistant had just said. Marcus was watching him closely, a slight frown creasing his forehead. "You okay?" For a brief moment, Jamal considered brushing it off. He had done it so many times before, told himself he was fine, that he could handle it. But something in Marcus's eyes made him hesitate. Marcus was younger, still in the early stages of his career, but Jamal could see the same fire in him that had once burned in himself. Marcus believed in the law, in justice, in the possibility of real change. And while Jamal admired that, he also worried for his assistant. He knew how long the road was, and how much it could wear on a person. "Actually," Jamal said slowly, choosing his words carefully, "something happened this morning." Marcus raised an eyebrow, leaning in slightly. "What do you mean?" Is everything okay? Jamal hesitated for a moment, then decided to tell them the truth. I got stopped by the police on my way here. It was nothing. Well, I guess that's not true. It was something. They accused me of looking suspicious, wanted to search my car. If it hadn't been for a captain who stepped in, I'm not sure how it would have ended. The words hung in the air between them, and Marcus's eyes widened slightly, his face a mix of shock and understanding. Man, I'm sorry. I didn't realize. I thought you just... He cut himself off, shaking his head. That's messed up. Did they give any reason? Or were they just fishing? Jamal's lips twisted into a bitter smile. Fishing, as usual. I wasn't doing anything wrong, just existing in the wrong place at the wrong time, I guess. Marcus's face darkened with anger. That's insane. I mean, I've heard stories, but you're one of the best lawyers in the city. How can they just... He stopped himself again, frustration clear in his eyes. Sorry. I know you don't need me telling you this. It's not right. Jamal nodded. It never is, but it happens, more often than you think. Marcus was silent for a moment, his brow furrowed as he absorbed what Jamal had said. Do you think it's ever going to change? Jamal paused. He had asked himself that same question 1,000 times over the years. There had been moments, glimmers of hope, when it seemed like progress was being made. Landmark court decisions, reforms that promised to address systemic racism. But then, there were the countless times when that progress seemed to unravel, when another black man was gunned down in the street, or when another protest erupted after yet another injustice. I don't know, Jamal admitted finally. I'd like to think it can, but it's going to take a lot more than what we've been doing. It's going to take people like you, Marcus, people who still believe it can change. Marcus looked down at the floor for a moment, then back up at Jamal, determination in his eyes. I do believe it, and I want to be part of that change. But Dan, hearing this, it just makes it feel so much harder. Jamal clapped a hand on his shoulder. It is hard, but that's why we do what we do. That's why we're here, fighting these battles. Because if we don't, who will? Marcus nodded, his resolve firming. You're right. Let's win this case. Let's start there. Jamal smiled, feeling a flicker of the same determination that had once driven him when he was Marcus's age. Let's go. The two of them entered the conference room, where the nonprofit's leadership team was already gathered around the long, polished table. Jamal immediately shifted into lawyer mode, greeting the clients with handshakes and reassuring smiles. But even as they settled into the meeting, the weight of the morning's events clung to him like a shadow. The meeting itself was intense, filled with legal strategy discussions, document reviews, and planning for the upcoming court date. Jamal found himself slipping into his natural rhythm, dissecting every piece of evidence, anticipating the opposition's arguments, and guiding his clients through the maze of legal procedures. This was his world, the one place where he felt fully in control. Here, in the legal battlefield, he knew how to navigate every twist and turn. But underneath that control, the tension from his earlier encounter remained. He couldn't shake the feeling that no matter how many cases he won, no matter how many injustices he fought, the system was still stacked against him and people who looked like him. Halfway through the meeting, while they were discussing a critical point about zoning laws, one of the nonprofit's board members, an older white man named Gerald, asked Jamal a question. It was an innocent enough question, but the tone, the subtle undercurrent of doubt, hit Jamal harder than he expected. Jamal, are you sure this is the best strategy? Gerald asked, his voice tinged with skepticism. I just want to make sure we're not being too aggressive. We don't want to come across as too adversarial, you know. We need to win, but we also need to play this carefully. The question landed like a punch to the gut. It was the kind of question Jamal had fielded dozens of times in his career, but today, after everything that had happened, it grated on him in a way it hadn't before. He could feel the weight of Gerald's doubt, The implicit suggestion that Jamal, as a black man, might not know how to play the game the right way, that he might be too aggressive, too confrontational. Jamal took a deep breath, keeping his voice steady. "I understand your concern, Gerald, but I assure you, this is the right strategy. We need to push hard, because if we don't, they'll steamroll us. This case is too important to play it safe." Gerald nodded, though the doubt still lingered in his eyes. Jamal moved on, continuing with the discussion, but the moment stuck with him. Even here, in this room where he was the expert, where his expertise should have been unquestioned, he was still being second-guessed. As the meeting wrapped up, Jamal couldn't shake the feeling that he was fighting on too many fronts. The legal battles in the courtroom were hard enough, but the unspoken battles, the ones fought in the streets, in the minds of those who doubted him, in the systemic biases that permeated every aspect of his life, those were the ones that wore him down the most. He left the conference room with Marcus by his side, the weight of the day settling heavily on his shoulders. But as they walked toward the office door, Jamal felt a renewed sense of purpose. The world wasn't going to change on its own, and there were no guarantees that it ever would. But as long as he had breath in his body, he would keep fighting, for himself, for his father, for Marcus, and for everyone who deserved to live without fear, without doubt, without having to constantly prove their worth. Because that was the real battle, the battle for dignity, for justice, for humanity. And it was a battle worth fighting. Behind closed doors, the sun was already beginning to dip behind the horizon, casting a warm amber glow over the city as Jamal and Marcus left the office. The long meeting had drained Jamal, not just physically but mentally and emotionally as well. The weight of Gerald's subtle doubt, layered on top of the encounter with the police that morning, had settled into Jamal's bones, heavy and unshakable. "Hey, I'm gonna head out early tonight," Marcus said, breaking the silence as they walked toward the parking garage. "Got some stuff to catch up on, but I'll be back in first thing tomorrow to prep for the deposition." Jamal nodded, appreciating Marcus's diligence. "Take it easy, man. You've been putting in long hours." Marcus gave him a tired smile. "Trying to keep up with you, boss." He hesitated for a moment, glancing at Jamal before speaking again. "Look, I've been thinking about what you told me earlier, about what happened with the cops. It's been on my mind all day." Jamal stopped walking and turned to face his assistant. He could see the concern etched in Marcus's expression, the frustration bubbling just beneath the surface. Jamal knew that look well. It was the look of someone just beginning to understand the full scope of the battles they would face for the rest of their life. "I know," Jamal said quietly. "It's not easy to deal with, especially when you're just starting out. But you learn to manage it. You don't have a choice." Marcus shook his head. "It shouldn't have to be like that, though. It's like, no matter what we do, no matter how successful we are, they still see us as suspects first, like we don't belong." He paused, his voice thick with frustration. "And I can't shake the feeling that this is just the beginning for me, that I'm gonna have to go through what you went through today over and over again. I'm not sure how to handle it." Jamal placed a hand on Marcus's shoulder. He could feel the tension radiating off the younger man, the weight of the reality that was slowly sinking in. "You're right, it shouldn't be like that. But it is, and it's something you'll have to learn to navigate. The key is not letting it break you." Marcus stared at him for a long moment, as if trying to absorb the advice. But Jamal knew it wasn't something he could fully understand until it happened to him. Until he stood in Jamal's shoes, face to face with the same kind of injustice. "Take care of yourself, Marcus," Jamal said. "We'll talk more tomorrow." Marcus nodded, offering a small smile. "Thanks, Jamal. I appreciate it." They parted ways, and as Jamal walked to his car, the weight of the day seemed to intensify with each step. He slipped into the driver's seat of his sedan and closed the door, shutting out the world for a moment. The car felt like a small sanctuary, a place where he could breathe without the constant pressure of the outside world pressing in on him. His phone buzzed again, and Jamal glanced at the screen. Another message from his mother. "Just checking in. Don't be late for dinner." Jamal sighed, his heart softening at the sight of the message. His mother had always been the pillar of their family, the one who held them together through thick and thin. She had raised Jamal and his two younger sisters with an unwavering strength, even in the face of adversity. But what his mother didn't know was the full extent of the burden her son carried. How often he found himself caught between two worlds, fighting battles that she had hoped he would never have to face. He knew that tonight's dinner would be the same as always, warm, comforting, filled with laughter and conversation. His sisters, Natalie and Carla, would be there, teasing him about his workaholic tendencies, and his mother would fuss over him, making sure he ate enough. It was a routine, a tradition that grounded him. But as Jamal started the engine and pulled out of the garage, he couldn't shake the feeling that this time, something was different. The morning's encounter with the police had opened an old wound, one that never fully healed. And Gerald's subtle doubt during the meeting had only added to the sting. He wasn't just tired, he was weary. Weary of the constant struggle, of the microaggressions, the coded language, and the overt hostility that still colored so many interactions in his life. The drive to his mother's house took him through familiar streets, tree-lined avenues that had changed little since his childhood. His mother still lived in the same modest, two-story home where Jamal had grown up, and though the neighborhood had evolved over the years, it was still home. It was the one place where he could find solace, even if just for a few hours. As he pulled into the driveway, the scent of jasmine from his mother's garden greeted him, a scent that always reminded him of summer evenings spent playing outside as a child. He stepped out of the car, taking a moment to appreciate the calm that washed over him as he approached the front door. Before he could knock, the door swung open, and his mother stood there with her hands on her hips, a mock stern expression on her face. "You're 5 minutes late, mister. You know how I feel about punctuality." Jamal chuckled, leaning in to kiss her cheek. 5 minutes. You're getting soft. Mom, I thought you'd be mad if I was even 1 minute late. She swatted him playfully. You know I'm just happy to have you here. Now get inside before the food gets cold. As soon as Jamal stepped inside, the warmth of the house enveloped him. The smell of homemade lasagna, his mother's specialty, filled the air, and the familiar sounds of his sisters' voices echoed from the dining room. For a moment, the weight of the day lifted, replaced by the comforting routine of family. "Look who finally decided to show up," Carla called out from the dining room. "Mr. Big-Time Lawyer, gracing us with his presence." Natalie, his younger sister, grinned at him as she stood at the table, setting out plates. "Yeah, we were starting to think you'd forgotten about us." Jamal shook his head, laughing. "You two never let me live anything down, do you?" His mother, standing behind him, gave him a soft smile. "They only tease because they love you. Now sit, everyone. Dinner's ready." The meal was everything Jamal had expected it to be. Delicious, hearty, and filled with lively conversation. His sisters talked about their jobs, their plans for the weekend, and shared stories from their day. His mother chimed in, laughing at their jokes and offering gentle reminders about their family's upcoming reunion. The house buzzed with warmth, and for a while, Jamal allowed himself to relax, to be present with his family. But beneath the surface, the weight of the day still lingered. He found himself drifting in and out of the conversation, his thoughts returning to the incident with the police, to the way Officer Jenkins had looked at him, like he was less than human. He replayed the moment in his mind, wondering what would have happened if Captain Mills hadn't intervened. Would he have ended up in handcuffs, or worse? The questions gnawed at him, refusing to be silenced. "Jamal, are you okay?" His mother's voice broke through his thoughts, and he realized that everyone at the table was looking at him. "Yeah," Jamal said quickly, forcing a smile. "Just thinking about work." His mother raised an eyebrow, her eyes narrowing slightly. "You've been quiet tonight. That's not like you. Jamal hesitated, his gaze flicking between his mother and his sisters. He didn't want to ruin the mood of the evening by bringing up what had happened, but at the same time, he couldn't keep carrying the weight of it on his own. "There's been a lot on my mind," he admitted, pushing his plate aside. "Something happened this morning, and it's been hard to shake." His sisters exchanged glances, and his mother leaned forward, her face softening with concern. "What happened, honey?" Jamal took a deep breath, deciding to finally share the truth. "I got stopped by the police on my way to work. They accused me of being suspicious, wanted to search my car. It got tense, and I don't know how it would have ended if a captain hadn't stepped in." The room went silent. His mother's face paled, her hands trembling slightly as she reached for her glass of water. Carla and Natalie looked at him with a mixture of shock and anger, their usual playfulness replaced by somber expressions. His mother was the first to speak, her voice quiet but heavy with emotion. "Jamal, are you okay? Did they hurt you?" Jamal shook his head. "No, Mom, they didn't. But it wasn't about that. It was about how they looked at me, how they saw me, like I was a criminal, like I didn't belong. It's not the first time something like this has happened, but today, it was different. It felt like a reminder that no matter what I do, no matter how successful I am, there are still people who see me as less." Tears welled up in his mother's eyes, and she reached across the table to take his hand. "I'm so sorry, Jamal. I hate that this keeps happening to you." Natalie, her voice tight with anger, added, "This is exactly why we need to keep fighting. This kind of thing can't keep happening." Carla, normally the more carefree of the three, was visibly upset. "It makes me sick to think that you, of all people, had to go through that." Jamal looked at his family, their faces filled with love and concern, and for the first time in a long while, he allowed himself to feel the weight of their support. He had always tried to protect them from these stories, to spare them the pain of knowing what he went through on a regular basis. But sitting here now, with their hands reaching out to him, he realized that he didn't have to carry it all alone. "I know," Jamal said softly. "I know you hate hearing about it, but it's the reality we live in. And as much as it hurts, we can't ignore it. We can't pretend it doesn't exist." His mother nodded, tears slipping down her cheeks. I just want you to be safe. That's all I've ever wanted." Jamal squeezed her hand, his heart aching for her. "I know, Mom, and I'll be okay. I'll keep fighting. We all will." The room fell silent again, but this time it wasn't the uncomfortable silence of before. It was a silence filled with understanding, with shared pain and love. They didn't have all the answers, but they had each other. And in that moment, it was enough. As the evening drew to a close, Jamal helped his mother clear the table, the warmth of the house still wrapping around him like a comforting blanket. The conversation from earlier still lingered in the back of his mind, but the burden felt lighter now. Sharing it with his family had made it easier to bear. Before leaving, Jamal hugged his mother tightly, pressing a kiss to the top of her head. "Thanks for dinner, Mom." She smiled up at him, her eyes still watery but filled with love. "Anytime, honey. Just promise me you'll be careful, okay?" "I will," Jamal said softly. "I promise." As he drove home that night, the city's lights twinkling around him, Jamal felt a quiet resolve settle within him. The world wasn't going to change overnight, and there would be more battles ahead, both in the courtroom and out in the streets. But he wasn't fighting alone. He had his family, his colleagues, and his own unbreakable spirit. And that, for now, was enough to keep him moving forward. The echoes of justice. The next morning arrived with the same rhythmic hum of the city, but Jamal West awoke with a new sense of clarity. The night at his mother's house had done more than provide him with comfort. It had reminded him of the quiet strength that came from those who loved him. His family's support was a powerful anchor, one that had always pulled him back from the edge when the pressures of life became too much. As he prepared for another long day at the office, Jamal reflected on the emotional weight of the past 24 hours. The confrontation with the police had shaken him to his core, and while dinner with his family had brought him solace, it hadn't erased the sting of what had happened. But instead of letting it fester, Jamal made a decision. He was done hiding. He would no longer bury these experiences under layers of professionalism or silence. It was time to confront the injustices he faced, both in the courtroom and in his own life, with unflinching honesty. By the time Jamal arrived at the office, the sun was just beginning to filter through the tall glass windows, casting long shadows across the floor. The morning buzz of activity had already started. Paralegals shuffling papers, phones ringing, and the low murmur of voices in discussion. Jamal strode toward his office with purpose, greeted by his assistant Marcus, who was already at his desk, poring over documents. "Morning, Jamal," Marcus said, looking up from the files. "I've got everything ready for today's deposition. We're going to be focusing on the cross-examination strategy for the city's zoning commissioner. If we can get him to slip up on his rationale for the discriminatory housing practices, we've got a strong chance at winning." Jamal nodded, appreciative of Marcus's thoroughness. But before diving into the legal preparations, Jamal had something else on his mind. "Marcus, can we talk for a minute?" Marcus raised an eyebrow, sensing the seriousness in Jamal's tone. He stood up and followed Jamal into his office, closing the door behind him. Jamal motioned for him to sit down across from his desk. "I've been thinking a lot about what we talked about yesterday," Jamal began, leaning forward, his hands clasped together on the desk. "About what happened with the police and how I've been handling situations like that for years." Marcus nodded, his expression thoughtful. "Yeah, I've been thinking about it too. I couldn't stop thinking about it, actually." Jamal took a deep breath, choosing his next words carefully. "I realized that I spent most of my career hiding these parts of my life from people, from you, from my colleagues, from clients. It's like I've been living two lives. There's the lawyer, the professional, the man people respect in the courtroom. And then there's the man who gets pulled over for looking suspicious, who faces doubt and discrimination, no matter how successful he becomes." Marcus's eyes darkened with empathy, but he stayed quiet, waiting for Jamal to continue. "I've always felt like I had to compartmentalize those two identities to survive. I thought that keeping them separate would protect me, that it would allow me to keep moving forward without being weighed down by the constant microaggressions, the racism, the assumptions people make about me." Jamal's voice softened, a rare vulnerability creeping in. "But now I see that it hasn't protected me at all. It's just made me tired, exhausted, really." Marcus nodded slowly. "I can't imagine what it's been like for you. I mean, I know I'm going to have to deal with a lot of the same things, but to hear it from you, someone I look up to, it hits different." Jamal leaned back in his chair, his gaze distant for a moment before returning to Marcus. "I've been thinking about how we move forward, how I move forward. And I've come to the conclusion that I need to be honest about these experiences, not just with you, but with everyone. I need to stop pretending that I'm immune to the injustices that so many people like us face every day. And I think it's time we start using this firm to fight not only for justice in the courtroom, but for justice in the world we live in." Marcus's eyes widened, a spark of excitement igniting in his expression. "What do you mean?" "Like expanding our work beyond just housing cases." Jamal nodded. "Exactly. We've been doing good work, but I've been thinking about how we can make a bigger impact. We're in a position where we can amplify the voices of those who don't have the same platform. We can take on more civil rights cases, police misconduct, racial profiling, workplace discrimination. I want to fight for the people who don't have the resources to fight for themselves." Marcus leaned forward, his enthusiasm palpable. "I love that idea. There's so much we can do, especially now, with everything that's happening in the world. People need representation. They need lawyers who understand what they're going through." Jamal smiled, feeling the surge of energy he hadn't felt in a long time. "And we're going to be those lawyers. But it's not just about taking on more cases. It's about being visible, about sharing our own experiences so people know they're not alone. I'm done with staying silent. If my story can help someone else, then I need to tell it. Marcus nodded in agreement, his respect for Jamal deepening. I'm with you. Whatever you need, I'm here for it. Jamal felt a weight lift from his chest, a sense of clarity and purpose that had been missing for so long. This was what he needed, to stop running from the reality of his own experiences and start facing them head-on. But more than that, he needed to use his position to help others, to fight the battle that too many people had been forced to fight alone. With a newfound sense of determination, Jamal stood up. Let's get to work. We've got a deposition to win today, and after that, we'll start planning how we're going to expand our practice. Marcus smiled, standing as well. Let's do it. The deposition took place in a large, sterile conference room downtown, the kind of space where legal dramas often played out behind closed doors. Jamal and Marcus arrived early, setting up their materials and reviewing their strategy one last time. The opposing counsel had been representing the city's housing commission for months, defending the discriminatory zoning practices that disproportionately impacted Black and brown families. Today's deposition would be crucial in dismantling their arguments. As the city's zoning commissioner, a middle-aged man named Randall Stewart, entered the room, Jamal noted the way he carried himself, calm, almost smug. Stewart had been one of the key players in crafting the zoning laws that had led to the displacement of countless families, and he clearly believed he could talk his way out of any accusations of wrongdoing. The court reporter swore Stewart in, and the deposition began. Jamal wasted no time in getting to the heart of the matter, his voice steady and commanding as he questioned the commissioner. Mr. Stewart, Jamal began, can you explain the rationale behind the zoning regulations implemented in the Garfield Heights neighborhood in the past 3 years? Stewart cleared his throat, adjusting his tie as he leaned forward. The zoning regulations were designed to promote economic growth and development in underutilized areas. Garfield Heights, in particular, was identified as an area in need of revitalization. Jamal raised an eyebrow, his tone calm but cutting. Revitalization, you say? And yet, during this so-called revitalization, over 40% of the original residents of Garfield Heights were displaced, the majority of whom were Black and Hispanic families. How do you reconcile that with your claim of promoting economic growth? Stewart shifted in his seat, a hint of discomfort flashing in his eyes. Well, displacement is an unfortunate side effect of progress. We've offered assistance to the displaced residents, ensuring they had access to affordable housing options elsewhere in the city. Jamal didn't let the response slide. Assistance that, according to our records, has been minimal at best. Many of those residents were forced to relocate to neighborhoods with fewer resources, farther from their jobs and schools. Do you believe that qualifies as adequate assistance? Stewart's smug expression began to falter. We've done the best we can with the resources available to us. The best you can, Jamal repeated, his voice sharp. And yet, the city has poured millions into attracting luxury developers to Garfield Heights, while spending a fraction of that on relocation support for the displaced families. Does that sound like equitable use of resources to you, Mr. Stewart? The commissioner's face reddened slightly, but he maintained his composure. The city's priority has always been growth and development. Unfortunately, we can't control all of the outcomes. Jamal leaned forward, his gaze piercing. But you can control where the money goes. You can control whether families are pushed out of their homes to make way for high-end developments. You can control whether or not those families are given the opportunity to return to their neighborhood once the so-called revitalization is complete. Isn't that true? Stewart shifted again, his confidence visibly shaken now. Yes, we could have done more. But that doesn't mean we intended to displace people. Jamal's voice was steady, relentless. Intent doesn't change the outcome, Mr. Stewart. The fact remains that your policies have disproportionately impacted minority communities, forcing them out of neighborhoods they've lived in for generations. And the city has done little to remedy that. The silence in the room was thick. Stewart's attorney shifted uncomfortably beside him, clearly aware that the deposition wasn't going well for his client. Jamal could feel the momentum shifting in their favor. The more Stewart squirmed, the more cracks appeared in the city's defense. By the time the deposition concluded, Jamal knew they had landed several critical blows. Stewart's testimony had revealed the inherent inequities in the city's zoning practices, and Jamal was confident they could use it to their advantage in court. As they left the conference room, Marcus turned to Jamal with a wide grin. "We got him." He couldn't keep it together. Jamal smiled, though it was a tired smile. "Yeah, we did. But the fight's not over yet. This was just one step." Marcus nodded, the seriousness of the situation not lost on him. "Still, it feels good to win these little battles." Jamal clapped him on the back as they walked toward the exit. "It does. And we'll keep winning, Marcus, one case at a time." But as they stepped into the bright afternoon sunlight, Jamal knew that the battles ahead would be even tougher. They would be taking on not just systemic injustices, but the deeply ingrained biases that allowed those injustices to persist. It was a daunting task, but Jamal felt ready. He had Marcus by his side, a team of dedicated lawyers, and a renewed sense of purpose. For the first time in a long while, Jamal felt like he wasn't just fighting for survival. He was fighting to change the world.